I'm Ksenia, and today we're going to look at the chart of Elvis Presley. I was so excited when someone suggested that I do this chart, and I'll tell you why. Because years ago, almost in another lifetime, when I was very young in my 20s, I was married to a guy who was an Elvis impersonator, funnily enough, and he's gone on to become quite a big name in the rockabilly scene. But he began as an Elvis impersonator. And so I spent a good deal of my 20s immersed in Elvis. And in fact, he actually won a competition here in Australia. And we won a trip to Memphis and Tupelo, where Elvis was born, for him to compete and perform overseas. So it was fun times in my Jupiter Dasher with lots of exciting things happening, lots of travel, lots of soul expansion, as is the nature of Jupiter. So naturally, when someone suggested that I do the chart of Elvis, I was pretty stoked. I thought, yeah, I can talk about Elvis. I know about Elvis. So we're doing his chart today. And now I've mentioned many times that I'm not actually a big celebrity watcher, but I do find that studying the charts of celebrities is the most fabulous way to learn astrology and to see what pieces of my own chart play out in the celebrities that I admire or that I feel connected to, or that there's some kind of a liking there or a resonance there. And so, you might not be into celebrities, but hey, you can still learn astrology by looking at a celebrity chart and seeing how it might actually apply to your own life and your own life story, and in what capacity. And it's really actually interesting to look at the charts of Elvis impersonators and compare them with Elvis himself, because there are usually a lot of similarities to between the two people, I've looked at the chart of quite a few, and yes, definitely it's a big player. So let's have a look at his chart now, and see just exactly what this man was really all about, what was going on in his life, the key pivotal moments in his life, and his relationships with his family, with his mother, his heritage, his roots, his lineage, and then what he rose up into in the second half of his life. So without further ado, let's go and look at Elvis. So let's begin with a quick overview of who Elvis Presley was. He was arguably the most famous entertainer in history. He continues, even posthumously, 40 years after his death, he's still earning in excess of $50 million annually to his estate. He lived his life in two parts. He was born into extreme poverty and very difficult life circumstances, and grew up quite a loner, quite isolated, sort of from people around him due to poverty and just being of a very, we'll get into this in a minute, very Piscean type nature. He actually lived his life in two parts, where by 21 he suddenly became famous, and so he went from this extreme poverty to this extreme notoriety, popularity, fame, and wealth. And very much a life in two parts, because he died at 42 of a prescription drug overdose, and he actually began utilizing prescription drugs very early on in his life. So this had been something that had been ongoing for many years to help him cope with, the extreme sensitivity that he had as a person, and to help him cope with the lifestyle that he then led from 21 years old onwards of, excessive touring, the fame, and being such a sensitive person, the overwhelm of the lifestyle that he led. And he coped with that through drugs to wake him up, to put him to sleep, and that's what really killed him in the end. And also bad eating habits probably didn't help much either. But he was just enormously successful. He had 107 top 40 hits, which is twice as many as the Beatles had. He had 41 gold LPs. He was known to be a very generous person, very sensitive, as I said, but always smiling, always gracious, always considerate and thoughtful type person. And he, interestingly enough, was a very spiritual person who loved astrology. So let's move now to his chart and have a look at that. So here we see Elvis's birth chart. Now Elvis was born on the 8th of January 1935 and believed to have been born at 4:35 a.m. in the morning in Tupelo, Mississippi. And the first thing I notice when I look at Elvis's chart from a purely removed point of view, where I'm not knowing who I'm looking at, so to speak, the first thing that leaps out at me is that he has all his celestial planets, this is Pluto, Uranus and Neptune, on one side of his one hemispheric side, the western side of the hemisphere of his horoscope. Now this gives a very fated element to his life, a fated feeling to his life. That is the side of fate, the western hemisphere, the side that the sun sets on. This is the side of fate, and so to have these celestial invisible planets that relate to our deepest subconscious and our psyche, to have all of those three planets sitting alone, like there's no other visible planets on that side of in the hemisphere, to have all of those together gives a great emphasis on fate in a person's life. And very fated events that come from like almost a karmic destiny type thing playing out. So, and this is what happened to Elvis. He was in the right place at the right time. Sam Phillips was the record producer looking for someone to bring the beat sound that was so popular in the South to a mass audience throughout America. And then in walked Elvis, a young 21-year-old. He might have even been a bit younger than that, just from recollection, before he hit the big time, sort of probably 19 years old, 20 years old, walks in and Sam Phillips hears him sing and thinks, yeah, let's give this guy a crack, see what happens. And everything fell into place. Fate played its hand. And Elvis then went on to become one of the world's most recognizable performers. And so this happened in August 1953. Elvis walked into Sun Studios, and it happened to be at the time when his ninth house was stacked, and trining his ascendant. The ninth house is the luckiest house in Vedic astrology. And Elvis had a number of planets all sitting tightly together in his ninth house, trining his ascendant, house of luck. Neptune and Saturn were conjunct in his 11th house of large groups of people, and rewards and gains, our dreams and goals. And Elvis had always dreamed of doing something with music. It was the one major thing he was passionate about throughout his childhood. And he was quite a shy boy and didn't sort of put himself up front too readily, but he had this passion for music. He would listen to radio shows and he would get guitar lessons off neighbors and things like that. So he was always, intrigued by and curious by and motivated by and inspired by music. And so when he walked into Sun Studios in August 1953, Neptune and Saturn, Neptune, the planet that rules music from a divine level, really, and Saturn, that hugely manifesting planet, were together conjunct in his 11th house of rewards and gains and large groups of people. I mean, what happened? He became the most recognizable person. Masses of people know who he is, large groups of people, that is. And the reward and gain for his passion and interest in astrology manifested. Not astrology. God. 11th house rules astrology, but no, the reward was for his massive interest in music. Forgive me there. And then Jupiter was sitting in his 7th house as well. So he needed a partnership in order to become the well-known person that he did become. And he needed to collaborate with somebody. Now, Jupiter is lord of his 1st house of Sagittarius, as you'll see. And Jupiter was sitting in the 7th house of Gemini at the time when he walked in, met Sam Phillips, and Sam and Elvis collaborated and his career really took off. So this is the partnership element coming into it. So that's what was occurring at the time Elvis transitioned basically from unknown, sort of poor, quiet young man into the superstar, the beginning of the transition into the superstar. But he has, like I said, these planets of fate, where he was always in the right place at the right time, and fate really took care of him in many ways. But the one celestial planet that I really want to hone in on is Neptune. Neptune, and we'll see by the end of this reading, Neptune is just the most massively powerful planet in his chart. Now he has, if you look at the chart, there are only good aspects coming from Neptune. He's got a sextile to Jupiter, lord of his first house, Sagittarius. He's got trines going down to his sun and to his Mercury. And so there are no hard aspects to Neptune. Neptune is a very powerful and beautiful benefic in his life. But as we'll also see, Elvis still manifested the more difficult traits of Neptune, that the addiction to drugs as a form of coping, as a form of escape, really. And you know, there were certainly difficulties with Neptune. But Neptune for Elvis is in the 10th house of career. And as I said before, Neptune rules music, divinely inspired music. And although Elvis didn't write any of his songs, his singing, his voice, and the way he channeled the expression of so many songs was exceptional. And certainly we could well describe it as being divinely inspired. And so his whole career was connected to anything of a Neptunian nature, music, film, because he did film acting as well. So these were two, you know, the two pivotal elements of Elvis's, you know, career. So when you have Neptune in the 12th house, you can sometimes experience some confusion with regard to your career vocation when you're younger. But the key is to remain receptive, to go with the flow, because Neptune will bring you those fatalistic career experiences. You need to follow where the universe leads when you've got Neptune on your midheaven. Follow your heart, use your strong intuition and trust it. And, you know, with Jupiter rising, Sagittarius rising and Jupiter in good dignity in Scorpio, Jupiter being the lord of the first house, Elvis would have had a pretty good intuition and been able to trust where his gut was leading him. Careers that would have been structured or corporate would never have suited Elvis. Neptune doesn't like structure and order, and he works better with inspiration, creativity, and going with the flow. And so Elvis was really good at trusting the omens and signals around him and following the right path. And we need to do that too when we have Neptune on the ascendant, on the midheaven. Basically, there's no control or willpower with this position. You know, trusting the universe in terms of your career is the only option. And as I said, very, very fatalistic life. You know, he was always in the right place at the right time in terms of his career opportunities befalling him. And there may have been ebbs and flows for Elvis in terms of his passion related to career. I know for certain that he got disillusioned, Neptune, with the whole film industry thing, because although he was offered magnificent film roles, the guy who he collaborated with, Colonel Tom Parker, who was his manager, sort of encouraged him not to take those wonderful films that might have seen him, you know, get up there for an Academy Award or some sort of reward of that nature. There were certainly Academy Award-winning film roles that he was offered, and made him stick with Hal Wallace, who was producing, you know, Girls, 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 and you know, Kissin' Cousins and all those films that really didn't amount to a great deal. They were very entertaining for the masses and the teenagers who loved him, let's just say. So, you know, he was definitely destined to have this creative career, this expressive career, this musical career. There was no way to escape it. It was part of his destiny. The other elements I want to look at, and we're going to sort of break this down into chunks and look at little different components of Elvis's life. But I just wanted to start with that super world changer capacity, and he certainly did change the world. If you have a reading with me, one of the things I often will refer to as being a world changer, and you know, that can happen on a global level. It can happen at a very intimate family level or even a personal level. We can change our world when we have a celestial planet, Neptune, Uranus, or Pluto, sitting on in an angular house or conjunct with the sun or the moon. And obviously, here's Elvis with world changer Neptune sitting in the 10th. He revolutionized everything about himself, his family, life, his destiny, his wealth, and his whole journey through life was revolutionized through his career, and he also has affected the lives of so many people. I mean, how many Elvis impersonators are out there trying to be like him, trying to emulate him, and, you know, dedicating their careers to being like Elvis. But that aside, then there's also just the musicians who've been inspired by him, who, you know, Cliff Richard was massively inspired by Elvis Presley, and that was just someone from that era. But Elvis's influence carries on into today as well. There are so many musicians that laud him as their inspiration, their inspirational figure. So this is the nature of Neptune, and when he's in such a prominent position in the horoscope. Now, the other thing that I want to note about Elvis, yes, he was very shy and a loner in youth. These are Neptunian qualities as well. We can feel a bit like we don't fit. We can feel like we're different to everybody else, or we're listening to a different drummer, you know, so to speak. We're following a different tune, a different path, and we can feel quite out of it with our peers who seem to be, you know, heading in a completely different direction to us. This is something that Neptune does, and it teaches us through that, you know. We tend to be very idealistic when we have a really strong Neptune. We tend to believe in the divine love, you know, that Neptune is all about. We tend to have unwavering trust in a higher source, whether that be divine love, whether that be God, whether that be you know, a belief in the universe and the goodness of the universe. You know, this there's definite spiritual belief associated with a strong Neptune, and Elvis was a very, very spiritual person. There's often healing that comes through Neptunian things, and many people, you know, have been healed, I'll use that in inverted commas, by the influence of Elvis's music, shall we say. So, you know, they're not going to be sort of have their broken leg cured by listening to an Elvis song, but his music is therapeutic, you know, that it's very calming, just inspiring, all these Neptunian words, inspiring, you know, it's quite, his voice can be very divine sounding, you know, and very empowering and very uplifting. So in that sense, on a soul level, there can be that element of healing or blessing that comes through listening to the music. So Neptune is this beautiful karmic planet playing out in Elvis's life. Venus in Elvis's chart, we're going to move on now because I know I talk an awful lot when I do my readings, and I want to try and keep this fairly concise. But take a peek at the North Node. It is conjunct with Venus. Now, when this happens, the North Node really influences the planet that it is with, and vice versa. So there's a real influence of Venus on Elvis's destiny. Well, Venus rules the voice. Venus rules also our appearance can be very, very sexy, very appealing, very beautiful. And Elvis is definitely considered one of the most charming, charismatic, and attractive looking men, which was part of his overall appeal. You know, women thought he was beautiful, men wanted to look like him, and this is the Neptune conjunct Venus conjunct North Node effect. And so I just wanted to point that out. Now, while we're in that area of his chart, take also a peek at the Sun being opposite Pluto. Now, this is really, really important. The Sun is opposite Pluto, and the Sun represents the father, and this is sitting in Capricorn. Now, Elvis's father really struggled actually to you know, he lacked a little bit of ambition and wasn't sure what he wanted to do in life. And Gladys, Elvis's mother, who was married to Elvis's father, Vernon, she was the real driving force, you know, trying to encourage him to do more and be more and provide for the family and so forth. But Elvis's father was not overly motivated in any particular direction. And at one point, Elvis's father actually ended up in jail for forgery. And this impacted Elvis quite a bit. Like, Elvis was very young when this happened, and his father was 8 months in prison. And because of this, Elvis and his mother had to move into accommodation with relatives, which, you know, in their poverty and the cramped conditions that they lived in would have been really difficult and traumatic. Plus, there was no money coming in from the man of the house, so to speak, to support them. So this would have really impacted Elvis's early life, and also played into how he related to his mum. And we'll get into that relationship in just a minute. But you'll note the Sun representing the father is opposite, opposite Pluto. Pluto is the modern day lord of Elvis's 12th house. The 12th house rules things like jails, prisons. It also is connected to any other form of sort of escape from reality, so to speak, from normal life. So it can also relate to ashrams or hospitals or mental institutions, and, you know, anything where we escape from the regular everyday lives that we lead. So it rules jails. And so Pluto, lord of the 12th house of jails, is opposite the Sun, which is representative of the father. So there's this big tension that has occurred in Elvis's life because the father was in jail for a period of time. And lo and behold, the Pluto element, the lord of the 12th house, is sitting in the 8th house. And this was something like that was not, I mean, it was a hidden thing, if you like, that Elvis's father had forged a check and forged a signature on a check. And so this is a secret that was found out and exposed, and therefore he had to go to jail. Now, that 8th house represents hidden things, other people's money. And Pluto, the planet of, you know, death and rebirth experiences, you know, the taking us into crisis. This is what played out for Vernon Presley, Elvis's father. This crisis occurred because he'd done, you know, criminal activities, basically. And so this is what we see playing out here with the Pluto opposing Sun element, or just one component of Pluto opposing Sun in Elvis's life. Now, because of this, this is one component of why Elvis was super connected to his mother. Their relationship was quite extreme, and in fact, he was teased at school for being a mama's boy. So we look now at the moon, and the moon has an out of sign conjunction with Saturn. Now, this is a really interesting dynamic, this one. And I should also point out that Elvis was a twin. He had a brother, Jesse, who died at birth. So there was always a sense of responsibility to the mother and taking care of the mother. Definitely, she was very important in his life, a very, you know, strong relationship there, and sort of a sense of,
sense of obligation to her, because the twin had died, and so, you know, I'm the one who lived, Mum, I'm here for you, you know, and father was in jail, I'll take care of you, Mum, no worries. That kind of a psyche that will have been established in the early life of Elvis. And indeed, he always took care of his family. He was a generous person, he was a kind person, and he took care of his parents and his family. But when we have the moon represented by the mother conjunct with Saturn, it indicates that whoever has this position, they had to grow up early. And this is obviously the case through what I've just described. It indicates that they had responsibility at a very young age. And it also is an indicator that the major caretaker is overburdened in life. And certainly he observed that in Gladys's life. She was, you know, trying to get the family ahead and wanted them to progress, and then, you know, just nothing wasn't manifesting for her, and then the husband went to jail, and she'd lost a son in childbirth, and so on and so on, and she was, you know, she suffered from depression, and she was on antidepressants for that, and she was not happy with her weight, probably exacerbated by the antidepressants, so she was taking diet pills, which is where Elvis was first introduced to that sort of stuff. And so this was not a happy woman. She was struggling a lot in life, and that made Elvis, you know, get this idea of, I must take responsibility for my mum, you know. And this is the nature of Saturn, you know, duties, responsibilities, hard work, being dependable, being mature, being responsible. This is Saturn, and when it's conjunct with the moon, the mother experience is influenced by the Saturn element. It can make it very difficult for a person to break away from duties and responsibilities to family when they've got this aspect, this conjunction in their chart. And this is especially true for Elvis because it's in the 4th house. Pisces is Elvis's 4th house, and the moon resides there in his chart. And so there is this very strong sense of obligation to the family. And there's also with this conjunction a need to please, and people with this conjunction will try very hard to please, and they're also scared of being hurt. Doubly so because Pisces is such a sensitive sign, such a, you know, a guarding my heart type sign. I don't want to, I don't want to be, you know, damaged, so to speak, but also Pisces picks up on things very easily, and they just are naturally very sensitive people. The most sensitive sign, actually. And so there is a need also to feel safe and secure as possible with this placement. This is, you know, look at what happened. Elvis bought Graceland, and his parents lived there with him, and he kept his world as safe and secure behind the walls of Graceland as possible. It was his escape, his haven. Saturn craves whatever planet it's with, and when it's with the moon, there is a craving for nurturance, for deep emotional bonds, and at a most basic level, a craving for home and family. And he certainly built that up around him, kept his family close. So with this intense relationship, it's actually no surprise that when Gladys passed away, Elvis was devastated, absolutely beside himself, devastated with this, the loss of the mother. People with this placement, they take their emotions seriously. I mean, Saturn is a serious planet. He's a heavy-duty dude, and the moon is our emotional life. So naturally, we take our emotions seriously. People like this will never let you down in practical terms. People with this placement will always cling to the tried and tested paths in relationships, because there's also a fear of being on one's own with this placement. And interestingly enough, Elvis always needed someone to sleep with him. So if it wasn't his wife Priscilla, it was usually somebody else out on the road, because he needed, it wasn't so much that he was an insatiable sex addict or anything like that. It was much more related to that fear of being on his own, fear of waking up on his own and being afraid, you know. Sometimes there's a bit of a mixed message with the Saturn-Moon conjunction. Then the mixed message is sort of like, you know, you never grow up fully from the mother. You know, you're always needed by the mother. So on the one hand, you have to be responsible for a mother who is overburdened and not coping with life. And on the other hand, You never really grow up fully because mother always needs you to be her little boy. And that was also the case with Gladys and Elvis. Now, also we've got the moon is in the sign of Pisces. Now, if anyone's taken Lada's fantastic course on the signs, you'll know all about the moon in Pisces. And I highly recommend Lada's course because, as we all know, she's the most amazing astrology teacher you can find. But the moon in Pisces, when we move it aside from the conjunction with Saturn, moon in Pisces indicates some of the most iconic and creative people. As Lada talks about in her course, you know, Frank Sinatra, Michael Jackson, Prince, Joni Mitchell, all these amazing singers and performers have moon in Pisces. And many of them also, just like Elvis, battled drugs as a form of escape. Or else they created an escapism for themselves like Michael Jackson did with Neverland, but Elvis also did with Graceland. So not only was it a need to protect and have security for the family for Elvis, but it's also an escapism, you know, rather than going to prison, Pisces, or 12th house, he created his own world of escape, which is, you know, great. If you've ever been to Graceland, it's absolutely beautiful and very inspiring, and moving, very moving place. So it also indicates when we've got moon in Pisces that the mother will be a very Piscean type person. You know, maybe her mothering style was caring or compassionate. Maybe it had no boundaries. This is possibly the case with Elvis and Gladys. And she was probably very kind-hearted as well, with this configuration in Elvis's chart. And, you know, it also it indicates that people with this placement have an emotional need for privacy. They have an emotional sensitivity that's almost beyond other people's sensitivities. And anyone who's done a biography on Elvis can tell you that he was a very sensitive person. He was very hurt very easily. But this is part of his charm. He was just a beautiful, gracious soul who wouldn't hurt anybody else because he knew what it felt like to be hurt himself. So it's actually a really beautiful placement to have moon in Pisces. Now, the next element that I want to have a look at is the Mars and Venus energy of his chart. Now, this is really, really interesting. I've spoken about how Venus was conjunct the North Node, and therefore it made him quite attractive and beautiful as far as men go, you know. Certainly, you know, considered to be one of the sexiest men that's ever lived, that I know of anyway. And then we also note now, though, when we're looking at Venus in terms of relationship and life partnership, Venus is in Capricorn. Now, this indicates that Elvis would have been looking for a wife who was he wanted a wife in a traditional sense. You know, Capricorn is a very traditional sign, and Venus is the planet of relationships. So he may have had many affairs and you know, relationships and so forth, but what he wanted in a, you know, committed partnership was this Capricornian ideal of the, you know, the dutiful wife, so to speak. But interestingly enough, Elvis has Mars in Libra, and Libra is a dualistic sign in terms of it is neither masculine nor feminine. It is both. And it's the only sign that's like this, actually. And so, you know, Libra is often seen as, you know, we often perceive it as a feminine side because it's all about relationships, but that's actually not true. Libra is incredibly tough, and I often use the analogy that it's like an iron fist in a velvet glove. You know, on the externals it looks like it's soft and lovely and warm, but internally it's tough, like strong masculine energy. So it's this combination of both, and I find that really captivating and appealing with Libra. But look where Elvis's Mars is. Mars is sitting in Libra, and so Elvis's masculine expression has this male female. He has this appeal to both men and women, and you'll note this you know, it wasn't just women who thought he was gorgeous and sexy and whatever. Men thought that too. Heterosexual men thought that too. And in fact, the masculine expression for Elvis really went even further, where he surrounded himself with masculine energy. And so this was a real contrast for Priscilla, who, you know, had to live in Graceland surrounded by what was commonly known as the Memphis Mafia, all these guys with their guns and their, you know, bodyguards for Elvis. And she sort of had to navigate this, what he wanted, which is a conventional relationship, marriage, but yet with all these guys around all the time. And so, you know, Elvis would be doing very masculine things like playing football and, you know, whatever they did with their guns and racing, car racing and so on, that very masculine appeal. And he had these guys around him all the time. And yet, Priscilla is the feminine energy, and she's having to navigate this relationship that Elvis had, which was very unusual, with all these male friends that were just always there. And it must have actually been quite difficult for her to form a really good relationship, or to have that kind of relationship that perhaps she wanted with Elvis, because there was no separation of the male and female. You know, it was like almost like he was married to the Memphis Mafia as much as he was married to her. The only difference was he'd be with her in the bedroom. So, and we see that when we look at the chart, and we see there's this masculine Mars planet in Libra making a square aspect to the planets in Capricorn, to you know, particularly the Sun, and to Mercury, which rules his 7th house of relationships. So this square to Mercury that rules the 7th house, Gemini, in Elvis's chart. And so this masculine energy is making it difficult for a real relationship to play out, in the sense that maybe Elvis actually really wanted, but I hope you're following my drift here, he wasn't able to perhaps manifest that in a way that was what he really wanted, because he had this need for masculine approval and to surround himself with that masculine energy. Now, we also notice, and this is probably one of the most important things to notice about Elvis, is that he was incredibly spiritual. Not only was he generous, not only was he kind, not only did he have this sort of appeal to men and women both, you know, we are all one. This is the nature of the 12th house, or the nature of Pisces. Now, this element of Elvis's life, forget the Capricorn sun, forget the Sag rising, Elvis was a very Neptunian, Piscean, 12th house person. How do we tell that? Well, firstly, he's got Neptune on the midheaven. This is extremely influential. The next thing we see is that his emotional life, is his moon sign is powerful in Pisces in the 4th house. Moon rules the 4th house. Next, we see that Jupiter, lord of his ascendant, is in the 12th house of Scorpio. And then the last thing that we notice, and this is very pivotal, his ascendant is at 12 degrees of Sagittarius. 12 degrees is the degree of Pisces. And so the Pisces, the 12th house, and Neptune, these are all connected. And in fact, Jupiter is the traditional ruler of Pisces, and it's the lord of his ascendant, which is Sagittarius. So there's all this 12th house influence, this Neptunian influence, this Pisces influence, and this made Elvis very generous. Jupiter, lord of his ascendant, is a very generous planet. It's benevolent, it's giving, it sees itself as the guru to bless others, to help others, and Elvis did that all the time. When I visited Graceland, it blew me away, the just extent of his generosity to his community, to random strangers, to friends, to family. I mean, it was second to none, his generosity, and this is that very Jupiterian kind of theme playing out. very benevolent. And then he was also very fascinated by spiritual things. He was intrigued by astrology, intrigued by numerology, and really had plenty of books about those sorts of things, about esoteric beliefs and mysticism, and he was always ravenously reading about that sort of thing. Plus, he had a very religious background. He'd grown up going to an Assemblies of God church and involved in the music there and that sort of thing. And this is seen by Sagittarius as a rising sign, which rules belief and faith. You know, it also is connected to religion, but much more in a positive sense. It's about belief and faith and trust in God. So Elvis was definitely that kind of a person. So this has just been a brief overview of his chart and the elements playing out in his chart and how they manifested in his life. And it's so fascinating to look at. But what is even more fascinating with Elvis's chart is to take a peek at the day he died. And so I'm just going to switch charts now, and we're going to have a look at what was going on in Elvis's chart on the day that he died. So here we are. This is the chart of the day Elvis died. Now you'll notice in this chart the inner circles, the inner planetary glyphs show the natal chart of Elvis Presley. I've also got a few fixed stars in there, which I tend to use a bit. That's the natal chart of Elvis Presley on the inside, and on the outside, the green glyphs, they are where the planets were on the 16th of August 1977, and Elvis died at 2:50 p.m. in the afternoon. And those planets, they're showing what was going down in terms of transits. And now we're going to have a look at how this actually was affecting Elvis on a personal level. Okay, obviously he died, but why? What was being triggered in his chart to cause this, profound event? And firstly, I just want to apologize if my chart when I do a reading like this, I'm assuming some sort of knowledge of astrological chart reading. You know, you understand where the houses are, where the signs are, what the glyphs of the planets mean. So forgive me if I've, caused you some confusion or exceeded your understanding of astrology with this assessment. I do hope it's beneficial to some people, but my apologies if I'm exceeding your understanding. Back to reading this chart and what was playing out. So, excuse me. Well, firstly, the first thing we see there is Neptune in the green glyph Neptune sitting bang on Elvis's ascendant degree of 12 degrees, that degree of Pisces. Neptune rules addiction and drug addiction and alcohol addiction and any type of addiction that we use to escape from the third dimensional reality that perhaps we are sort of coping well with. And so there is Neptune almost squaring itself. That's 2 degrees off squaring itself, and it's sitting on the ascendant. What did Elvis die of? Drug addiction and overly prescribed prescription drugs. You know, Elvis also had the tendency to kind of see his body as a little bit invincible, perhaps. I mean, yes, frustrated by the weight gain and those sorts of difficulties that unfolded for him, but he was ruled by Jupiter, and now Jupiter has this eternally optimistic view of life. And so to be ruled by Jupiter as the Lord of your first house, you have this eternal optimism about your capabilities. And you can tend to, one of the sort of more negative sides of Jupiter is to overextend yourself beyond what you can actually cope with. And this is what Elvis did in terms of taking the drugs that he needed every day to cope. Certainly went beyond what his body could really handle and cope with. And so Jupiter had that influence on Elvis. And he would be taking drugs to wake him up in the morning. He'd be taking drugs to help him go to sleep at night, just to cope with the everyday routine of his life, which included a lot of extensive touring that was very exhausting, and crazy hours of, getting to bed all hyped up after a performance and not being able to settle down and so on. It was a crazy lifestyle. And so these drugs supported Elvis, theoretically, in coping with that lifestyle, but they did just irreversible damage to his poor body. And so we see, at the time he died, Neptune was sitting on the ascendant. Now, Neptune is a slow-moving planet, and it would have been sitting there, quite some time, actually. So this wasn't a unique occurrence that it was sitting there. It might have, been there for weeks, to be honest. And so we need to sort of expand our look and see, well, what else was going on? Were there other triggers that, when they all combined together, led to his death? Well, let's take a look at transiting Pluto. Pluto is the modern lord of Elvis's 12th house, and the 12th house is connected to losses, and this means, loss of life, loss of anything really. Sorry, I should quantify that. My belief is that every sign, every planet, every house is like the yin-yang symbol in the Chinese horoscope. There is light and shadow in them all. And that means, if you want to use the terms good and bad, it's good and bad in them all. And we actually have free will about what we choose to manifest. Well, do we choose to manifest the higher qualities of Pluto, which is personal power, regeneration, through, coming out of crisis, having learned rich lessons that mature us and make us stronger? These are the more positive qualities of Pluto. Or do we go to the other end of the scale, which is, dabbling in crime and hidden, secretive actions that are a bit sinister, abuse, all those sorts of things that are very negative, if you like, Plutonian influences, and we can choose how we manifest this. So that's how I see the horoscope, that yin-yang kind of energy. Sorry, I've lost my train of thought. Why am I talking about that? We've got Pluto, the lord of the 12th house, and 12th house can be, that's where I got this point from. 12th house is connected to losses, and loss of life is obviously the main one, but Pluto is also traditionally, not in Elvis's chart per se, but traditionally the lord of the 8th house, which is about death and about endings. So here we've got Pluto, who is the lord of losses in Elvis's life, 12th house, as well as just naturally the nature of Pluto is to be connected to death, death and rebirth. And where's Pluto sitting on the day Elvis died? It is sitting conjunct Mars. Mars is things that can happen quickly. Mars is also the traditional lord of the 12th house of losses. Just aside, he's also the lord of the 5th house of entertainment for Elvis. So quite a pivotal planet for Elvis in that way. And so Pluto, the lord of death, and if you want to term it in just that really straightforward manner, is sitting with Mars, which is, things happen quickly, things happen fast. And both of them are the united lords of Elvis's 12th house. Interestingly enough, also there, North Node, transiting North Node, sitting with Elvis's natal Mars and Pluto. Now, not entirely bang on, but close enough to be very, very influential as well. And the North Node can cause these sorts of things. There's a destiny about the North Node. There's a, the North Node in shamanic astrology represents what we're rising up into. So it's very connected to our destiny. And I'll do a talk on the North and South Nodes in shamanic astrology at some point. But basically, there's a destiny, there's a karmic connection with the North Node, and that is because the nodes come from the travel of the moon and the point where the moon crosses the ecliptic. And the moon is like, the moon and Saturn are both like uber karmic planets in the horoscope. So when you've got this moon and having influence on the north and south nodes, as it does, it's the reason we have the nodes, there's this karmic connection for both the north and the south nodes. And so very karmic this day for Elvis, you know, when there's Mars there, there's Pluto there, Neptune's on the ascendant. What else is happening? Well, in a general sense, we've looked at all the celestial planets, or two of them, and now let's look at Uranus. Uranus is doing a 7-year transit of Elvis's 12th house. So there's this big 12th house emphasis coming from these 3 celestial planets in Elvis's chart. And remember, at the beginning I mentioned, these 3 celestial planets rule the hemisphere of fate in Elvis's life. They are connected to fatalistic occurrences for Elvis, predestined, you know, things that we can't escape from, things that are going to come our way regardless, you know, and our lesson in life is to learn to go with the flow with them. So here we have these 3 fatalistic planets all connecting in some way or another to the 12th house. Neptune is connected to the 12th house just by association, not necessarily Elvis's chart, but it's got big 12th house Piscean connections, obviously. Pluto is lord of Elvis's 12th house in a modern sense, and Uranus is transiting Elvis's 12th house. So there's this big theme there of 12th house karmic events and endings and losses, you know. So this is a 7-year process, but it's still significant enough that, you know, on this day we've got Uranus, planet of liberation, of change, of, you know, authenticity, of, you know, unexpected, sudden events going through his 12th house. And so what else have we got? Well, they're big key players, but we've got Saturn opposing Saturn. So at the time Elvis died, he was 42. That means he was going through his midlife transits. One of those happens to be Saturn opposing Saturn. And the Sun is there, conjunct with Saturn at this time. The Sun rules Elvis's 9th house. Remember that lucky house that manifested the opportunity to work with Sam Phillips, which then, you know, catapulted him into fame. But there's Saturn, and Saturn is lord of the house that the Sun resides in, which is the 2nd house Capricorn. So there's this, not only this celestial planetary influence happening, but Saturn is this manifesting planet, this karmic manifesting planet, because it's one of the visible planets we can see, opposing itself. Now, that, please don't think if you're going through your Saturn opposition, I'm going through that at the moment, please don't think that that's going to bring death. That's not what it brings, but it was another key sort of element thrown into the cauldron of what was happening on this particular day for Elvis. And the Sun was opposing Saturn as well on this day. So it was a very powerful day in terms of big triggers happening for Elvis. We've also got Venus. Venus on the 8th house cusp. You'll see green little Venus sitting over there in Cancer, sitting conjunct the 8th house cusp. And the 8th house is death, connected to death, endings, finishing things. Like there's similarities between the 8th and the 12th houses in terms of, you know, endings and losses and death. So there is Venus also contributing, sitting on the cusp. And whenever we have a planet on a house cusp, that is a triggering manifestation point. It can be going through, you know, just say Venus is traveling through Elvis's 8th house here, doing its thing, just traveling through, taking, you know, whatever period of time it's taking to get through Elvis's 8th house. But when it's doing psychological stuff in his life, but then when it bangs on the cusp point, it triggers a manifestation in the 3rd dimensional reality we live in. And that happens for everybody. And so what's it manifested in this time, in this lifetime? Well, it's manifesting eighth house things. One of those eighth house things in Elvis's life is a death. Now, I'm a believer in reincarnation. I believe that death is just a new beginning. You know, death and what follows is rebirth. So, you know, I don't see death as this tragic occurrence. Yes, it's a great loss to society to have lost Elvis and his contribution to music and beauty and joy and all entertainment and all the wonderful things he brought to the world. But it's not the end for Elvis. It was simply going through a death and rebirth cycle into a new existence, so to speak. But we've got Neptune sitting there on the 8th house cusp. That means some kind of manifestation occurring for Elvis. Now, the last point that I want to see here, talk about here, is Jupiter. Now, Jupiter is the lord of Elvis's rising sign, Sagittarius, as I've mentioned. And look where it is. It's at 29 degrees of Gemini. Getting ready, but like almost ready to move into the 8th house. When we've got a planet at the 29th degree, and this is a powerful planet for Elvis because it's the lord of his ascendant, when we have a planet at the 29th degree, it indicates some kind of important ending occurring in our life before we, like I just described, move into a new beginning at 0 degrees of the next sign. So here is Jupiter, lord of his ascendant, sitting at 29 degrees, ready to move into the 8th house of death and rebirth. This is really powerful. There's often crisis associated with this important 29th degree and change manifesting through some kind of sudden, unexpected crisis event. Well, what could be more of a crisis event than passing from one dimension of reality into another through death? So all of this stuff is playing out in Elvis's life the day he died. So it's not just one thing that triggers the passing. It's many things playing into the whole, you know, cauldron of soup, if you like, that is this experience for him. And the last thing, take a look at the moon. It's up there on the midheaven. It moves very fast through a sign. So probably within the next, probably the next 8 to 12 hours, the moon would have gone conjunct with his Neptune, a very karmic placement, as we've discovered. Elvis was so ruled by Neptune. And the moon was such a significant player in his life, and also the lord of his 8th house of death and rebirth. So a very powerful day unfolded in his life and in his journey, and unfortunately it meant the end of his journey. But as I said, he's been rebirthed, I believe, into something new, some kind of transition. So this has been a really interesting look, and I'm sorry to have been really heavy with it at the end and looking at death, but I find it really interesting to look at the key moments in people's lives and see what played out, what was happening, what was unfolding, and we learn so much. And this is the whole point of this video, to learn as much as we can about astrology through looking at the lives of people who who have been key players in the world. And it's really, that's why we use celebrity astrology, to help understand how things play out better, especially for those of us wanting to learn more astrology. So I'll just do a little bit of self-promo. If you're interested in a reading with me where I can look at all sorts of elements of what plays out in a chart and how they affect each other, and then, you know, by all means, look me up on Lada's readers page. I'd love to do a reading for you, and as all my clients will attest to, I tend to talk way over time because I love talking about astrology, so you'll get great value for money. So thanks for exploring a little bit of Elvis's chart with me. There's so much more we could go into, so much more we could explore with this amazing man and his life, but I think this is enough for now.
Thanks so much for joining me on this wonderful journey through the life of Elvis Presley. I hope you've learnt lots of astrology and perhaps a little bit of history as well. It's been fun for me, and I look forward to joining you next time with another fabulous chart to explore.